Well, the gospel question, as you heard from Father Gary, was how many people are in your family? So think about that. Just kind of keep that number in your head for a while. Now, if you had asked me that question 65 years ago, I would probably have answered 6. My mom and dad, my brother, and my 2 sisters. Maybe I would have said 8 because my grandpa and my grandmother also lived with us. If you asked me that question 50 years ago, I might have answered 2, my wife Mary and me. If you'd asked me that question 45 years ago, I would probably have said 4, Mary and I and our 2 daughters. Today, I'd probably say there are 8 in my family, Mary and I and our 2 daughters and our 2 grandchildren, Rose and Marty McDougall. Okay. Families have been around for quite a while, and we see this in both the human and the animal world. Granted, animal families are a bit different from human families in that its members are usually more numerous, like a pride of lions with a daddy lion, a number of mommy lions, and quite a few little baby lions. There are a lot of groupings of animals, birds, and fish in nature, including herds, flocks, troops, colonies, pods, packs, schools, bands, litters, nests, coveys, and my personal favorite, committees. That's a term applied to a group of vultures at rest. It's true. It's true. So just keep that in mind next time you're in a committee meeting. It'll help you. Okay. Well, the point is that God, through evolution and nature, seems to have set things up so that members of a species, including human beings, would live in family or family-like structures. And families provide the newborn members 2 critical things, food and protection. And for mammals like us humans, our newborn members would perish without the food and protection provided by the elders. So families are a good thing. Throughout human history, families have joined together to form clans, tribes, cities, states, and nations. It's a communal thing. Human progress seems to require it. And this phenomena is also a good thing. But the reality is that even good things can go bad. We all know that even a family can become dysfunctional, such as when the adult members abuse or neglect the vulnerable younger members. And the same is true for groupings of families such as cities, states, and nations. They too can go bad, as history so sadly teaches us. Now, the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, has for generations and generations been the gold standard for families. In Catholicism, we were all urged to model ourselves after the Holy Family, with the exception that we could have more than one child, and that child didn't have to be God. Although many of us thought that our little baby boys and girls were divine. Now, the Holy Family was held up as a model regarding how husbands and wives should treat each other and their children. Now, historically speaking, we know precious little about how that Holy Family actually lived. They were common people in their early years, and history took no notice of them until after Jesus' resurrection, death and resurrection. True, there are snippets of information in Scripture, but much of that is more theological than historical. In reality, there are some things about families of that time that we would not want to emulate in our day. It's highly unlikely that Mary would have decided to get a career and work outside the home. It's highly unlikely that Mary had equal say with Joseph in financial matters. It's highly unlikely that little Jesus was consulted by his parents on other family matters, which is probably a little short-sighted on their part, considering who he was. We can make some pretty good guesses of what the Holy Family's life was like, of course, through historical and anthropological studies of families at that time. Now, our real focus on the Holy Family should not be on those extraneous details, but on things that are lasting, enduring, permanent, and transcendental. Our Catholic faith has, and tradition, for many years praised the humility and steadfastness of Joseph, Mary's total openness to God's will, no matter the cost, and of course, everything that is good and holy about Jesus. It's, of course, those things that we should strive to emulate as families. But as I've said earlier in this homily, good things can go bad. And that, I think, is the challenge for all of us in this day and age as we look at our own families and at our extended families of cities, states, and nations. A family unit of any kind goes bad when it forgets that it is a small, albeit important, part of something larger. And this is the important yet unspoken point when we are asked, how many people are there in your family? The Holy Family lived in a culture that was both different from ours today, yet also the same. It was different in the obvious and usual ways, such as being much less patriarchal in our day than it was in Jesus' day. Notice I say much less as opposed to not at all. Families and society in that day and age and that place were very tribal. The Jewish culture actually consisted, as you know, of 12 tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. An honest reading of Scripture in the Old Testament, as it's called, reveals a people who were very exclusionary in their relationships with those who were not in the group they called the chosen people. Now, this served a good purpose in that it kept them separate from a polytheistic pagan culture that would have diminished or even maybe destroyed their allegiance to Yahweh, the one true God. Yet since good things can go bad, it happened to the Jews in their day and age as it happens to us in our day and age. They became closed and isolated with their rigid requirements for what was acceptable and for what constituted standards for inclusion in their religion and in their society. Now, when Jesus and his post-resurrection followers arrived on the scene, they had quite a bit to say about the exclusion of others who were not like us. The sayings, parables, and actions of Jesus were very clear. He preached universal acceptance and universal salvation. And he went so far as to say that the least worthy in the eyes of society were closer to the kingdom than were those who got praised for their ritualistic acts of piety. He used the despised Samaritan as an example of who is a good and holy person, as compared to the priest and the Levite who let the injured traveler lie in the gutter, beaten, bleeding, and dying, so concerned they were about breaking their so-called holy rules of ritual purity or being late to where they wanted to go. Jesus, as you know, was widely criticized for associating with public sinners, tax collectors, and prostitutes. St. Paul later came to the understanding that women were just as good as men. Slaves were just as good as slave owners, and Gentiles just as good as Jews. Now, we take those words for granted in our day, at least intellectually, but they were really very radical for the time. Jesus did not stay stuck in his family nor in his culture. He transcended both, and he tells us to do the same, to follow him. He never disowned his family, his culture, or his religion, but he transcended them all. And if we want to be holy individuals, holy families, holy cities, holy states, and holy nations, we must do the same. He told us to follow him, and that we must do. The message is clear, and Jesus understood it. There's one God. That one God is Father of all. We are all equally children of that one God. We all have the same divine DNA, and we are all descendants of God whose spirit was created and infused into matter in the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. This DNA of celestial stardust courses through our veins as much as the DNA of our ancestors from England, or Africa, or Ireland, or Afghanistan, or China, or Mexico, or wherever great-great-great-grandma and grandpa came from. Yes, we really are brothers and sisters, all of us. The salient question, therefore, is, if I'm really related to all these people, all who live now, all who have ever lived, and all who are yet to be born, why do I sometimes exclude, demean, look down, and ill-treat someone who's supposed to be part of my family? Think about it. Yeah, we may get angry or disagree with or maybe have little in common with one of our brothers or sisters. We know that happens in families. But do we turn on that sibling and treat them like garbage? Mostly not. but when we do, we're called to reconciliation. And the same holds true for the family of man. We may not always agree with or have much in common, at least on the surface, with those who seem different from us in their appearance, their customs, their attitude, their religion. But should we look down on them, exclude them, and demean them? Of course not. Not if we wish to claim the title of Christian or Catholic, which you know means universal. In these polarized times in which we live across the world and here at home in our country, there are loud voices who call us to be nationalistic, and not in the good sense of the word in emulating the very many good values of our country. Now let me be clear about this. I myself and many other men and women served in the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or Coast Guard, partially, yet imperfectly, to protect, defend, and preserve that which is the best in our democracy. So I'm not bashing our country. Please don't think I am. I'm talking about those loud voices that demand in shrill and hateful terms a fearful, isolationistic exclusion of those deemed not worthy of our attention, our time, our resources, and our love. Those voices that say to us only those who live within our national borders, who are like us, are worthy of the title brother and sister. These voices tell us that our family is very small indeed. But Jesus tells us that our family is much, much bigger. Bigger than most of us can begin to comprehend or dare to believe. So when I posed the gospel question, how many people are in your family? What was your answer? Was it 2, 4, 8, or 10? If so, would you like to reconsider your answer? Maybe up it a bit by a couple of million or a couple of billion or so? Let's all think about that as we go about our business this coming week. We're going to encounter a lot of people, and we know that, and they're either going to be strangers, and we just pass by, or we're going to see some beloved brothers and sisters whom we didn't realize were part of our family.